All right, ready for a little change of subject?
Yes, please.
A little change of subject. I did a little Twitter bomb right before this with my engagement hacking. So here's an open question for you. Total change of subject. We're going to talk about portfolio math here for a second. So everyone who's more interested in the Kentucky Derby can tune this out. But actually, last thing I'll say about the Kentucky Derby, if you can get a picture of Jason from the Kentucky Derby, he was looking fancy. I am not allowed to share what his outfit was, but he was looking fancy. I would urge you to try to hack his cell phone for those pictures. Okay. I want to talk portfolio math with you. You run a portfolio. You probably get benchmarked to something, right?
Yeah.
If I said to you, I want you to plot your cumulative excess returns of your portfolio versus that benchmark over time, how would you do it?
Like, how does everybody do it? They just take their annualized cumulative return over time, and that's what they use, which is, by the way, my least favorite metric by far. But why do you bring that one up?
So the excess return of the portfolio versus the benchmark, though.
Yeah.
The excess return. So you're saying they take their cumulative return annualized?
I think most people do annualized, which drives me nuts, instead of doing Kaker. And then what they do, that every time you see it drives me crazy, is like cumulative returns 800% and the market's 500%. And it just drives me crazy.
Yeah, but how do you, so over time, so what you're saying, plotting it over time, they would take at any point in time the cumulative total return and subtract the cumulative total return of the benchmark.
Yes, I believe that's how most people do it. And I, as you know, would always use Kaker, but I don't even think people are using Kaker. I think they just get lazy and annualize it and then subtract, right?
So this came up for us internally as to this is something we wanted to plot. And it seems like a very trivial question. Like, how do you, like, cumulative excess returns? That's not hard. Just take your returns, subtract the benchmark returns, plot them over time. Here's the problem. As a naive example, let's say you have your portfolio and your benchmark and you start them at a dollar each. On day one, the portfolio goes up 100% and the benchmark returns 0. And then every day afterwards, they both are positive 1% every day. If you take the total return of the portfolio minus the benchmark, that line will be positively sloped. Because what happens is that 1% every day afterwards, even though the benchmark's also earning 1%, it's 1% on a higher amount from that compounding amount from that initial 100% gap. And what I would argue is, well, you're actually returning the exact same amount every single day after. So why are your cumulative excess returns actually going up? Isn't it more telling if you're trying to plot something like this? Like, to me, what I'm trying to show is, did you outperform the benchmark? Well, other than that very first day, no, you didn't. I would think that that line should be a flat line, right? But it's not. The way you said, hey, take the total return, subtract them, plot them, it would not be a flat line. Other people argue, well, that actually is the cumulative excess return from the beginning. To me, it's only a cumulative excess return for someone who invested day one. Someone who invested day two actually has been totally flat versus the benchmark. Okay. So what's the other option? Some other options I could throw out there. You could take the ratio. One way to solve this is take the ratio of their returns. So, it's $1. They both start at $1. You take the ratio. It's at $1. The portfolio goes to 2. The underlying's $1. Great, that jumps up. And then every day after, as you take the ratio, it becomes a flat line. So the ratio shows the relative return. The problem is the ratio is not investable. That's not a return stream you can actually achieve. Okay, so how do I turn this into a return stream I could actually achieve? Well, another way of doing it is saying, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at their daily returns and take the difference. And then I'm going to compound that over time. It's a third way of doing it. What that effectively is doing is saying, I'm going to go long my portfolio and short the benchmark and rebalance daily. I think that's reasonable, but it brings up a question of, well, why not rebalance weekly? Why not rebalance monthly? Why not rebalance annually? Other than the rebalance timing luck of it all. That daily compound will actually have an impact on the cumulative returns versus if you did it weekly or monthly and allowed them to drift versus each other. By the way, once again, I throw something out on Twitter and people answer me with such unbelievable certainty. I am amazed people give me a little bit of credit that I've thought about these things a little bit. And if I'm asking what seems like a very obvious question, consider maybe it's not a very obvious question. Or maybe you're listening right now and saying, Corey, you're an idiot. The point I'm trying to make is something as simple as how do you plot cumulative excess returns, I think is a very non-trivial question.
Yeah.
And I think there's a bunch of these in finance that we spend so much time thinking about complexity that even something as simple as this actually goes very overlooked. And if you ask people to really seriously think about it, they kind of get themselves lost in circles, which I have, by the way. I don't think there's a good answer. I think it very much depends on what you're trying to show. I think 9 out of 10 times you should probably just plot the relative returns, like the ratio, and call it a relative return stream. But you have to acknowledge that's actually, that return stream is not what is investable. What it's more showing is the relative growth rate of the portfolios.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite subjects, at least tangentially too, about how averages lie and hide things, and the maps are not the territory. And we're delving right into the world of ergodicity, because what you really got to the point was, it actually matters what that individual return is, and who cares about the return of the ensemble over time. And as we've talked about many times, like ARC and everything is like, on a dollar weighted basis, like most people are going to lose money on ARC. That's just an inevitability of the flows of funds coming into ARC. And what people actually only care about is their return. And then, as much as I said, I even love Kager, Kager can be gamed just like all these other things can be gamed. Like, as we've seen a million times, if somebody spins up a hedge fund and the first year they're up 50 to 70%, and then the next few years they're, right around like 1-2%, their Kager is going to look great for a few years until like the law of large numbers works it out. But that's what they're going to market off of. And so you're really hiding that event within the Kager structure. So you have to, be very careful and wary of these things. And like you said, what's even crazier to me is like you're saying is like, not only how hard these things are plot, like how would you try to rationally or, in a way that makes sense, like project your cumulative excess returns. It's even shocking to me is how many people that have brokerage accounts at the large wirehouses where they can't even figure out what their own personal glide path has been. Right. Like it's surprisingly difficult. Like if you ask anybody, like what's your actual
wirehouses?
Yeah.
I go to Schwab or TD or any, like the RIAs, the broke custodians. Like it is non-trivial if you're putting money in, taking money out. Like I think it wasn't until last year someone like Schwab on their platform really actually was able to account for some of that in their reported returns, in their statements. Like that's all very non-trivial stuff. You have to consider like the compounding impacts of that on your portfolio return when you take it out.
And then to take this even like a level deeper into nerddom, as I was reading this morning, a great like multi-part essay by our homie Chris Abdul-Masih when he was talking about variance time. Have you read this at all?
Oh, loved it.
But like, I mean, it's only, nobody would really care about this. Like he's saying, you could use dirty variance for most people and they're just fine, right? But the idea was with variance time, where people used vol as a metric for variance, but it's really just variance. But it matters, are you using calendar days? Are you using business days? How is that accounting for weekends? How should we readjust our theos to figure out what variance time would be, where you would take into account weekends, but then you also take into account maybe FOMC meetings or everything we've seen lately with zero DTE options. And the whole idea goes back to me of Chronos and Kairos, back to the ancient Greeks. Chronos was clock time, and then Kairos was like the opportune moment. And what we talk about a lot in option space and vol land is time speeds up, slows down. And so if you're trading implied volatilities off of calendar time versus business day time on the annual basis, you can have very different implied volatilities, even though you're trading the same price. And so it just starts getting into then if you are going to blend the calendar and business times to a variance time, as he was suggesting, but then what kind of handicap or not do you give to those very auspicious days of like FOMC meetings or CPI that we've seen, and like how much those matter in the last year per se? But like, how do you weight those and create your own theoretical framework for that?
Well, especially because for most of the mid 2010s, those meetings didn't matter. Right? There were years and years in which it was like, no, we just know the rates are staying low. Right? So all of a sudden you have to go, historically, I could have weighted them at zero, not zero, but like it was an average business day, versus now they are much more of a profound impact in other economic news. Now, that's all because of the Fed reaction function, Jason, which I know is the other one that was getting me on
Fed watcher.
The other one that was getting me on my trip, speaking of vol, was like people just using VIX as shorthand for vol. And it's become so, like, whenever I hear that now, I've just got Ben Eifert from QVR ingrained in my head going, VIX is the 1 month strike of the strike of a 1 month forward variance swap. I'm like, and a variance swap strike should not be what a vol strike is because there's a convexity embedded in the vol that's not in the variance. And it's like, oh God, like every time I hear someone use VIX as shorthand, I'm like, I hope you know it's shorthand. I hope you're aware it's shorthand, but I'm not 100% sure you're just being dirty for the sake of we're just having a fast conversation, or whether you actually think that's the meaningful thing you think it is.
Yeah, I don't even want to head down that road because it just makes me angry whenever anybody brings up the VIX in general. But it did remind me on your road trip. What do you listen to? Podcasts? Do you listen to music? Do you listen to books? What do you do?
This is actually
silence.
This brings up a great conversation, Jason. Thank you for that. I know you didn't mean to do this. I was catching up on one of my favorite podcasts, which is Dean Kernut's Alpha.
Oh, here we go.
Exchange.
This is on my list. Yeah.
And I was catching up on his conversation with Roni Israelov from Endeavor, ex AQR, head of the vol desk there. And he was actually talking about a paper I co-authored with him, which was fun to hear someone else talk about a paper I co-authored. He explained it infinitely more elegantly than I could. So I think just he's going to be on the circuit now talking about the paper rather than me ever talking about it. But that was a lot of fun for me hearing about rebalance timing luck and the paper we co-authored. But you sent me a question afterwards that I think is a fertile ground for question and debate, which is Roni. One of the things he did at AQR was build out their vol risk premium harvesting strategies, largely multi-asset, so across rates, commodities, currencies, and equities. And he has written some papers about the difficulties of tail risk hedging. And one of the conversations you and I were having was, can you believe that there's a volatility risk premium you have to pay in tail risk hedging? So it's negative expected return from a linear perspective, but it allows you to add more leverage to your equities. And that extra equity risk premium more than offsets the drag from the volatility risk premium or variance risk premium. And or can you overcome it with the compounding effects? I think the first one's interesting just from the pure linear perspective of, okay, I'm adding some equity risk premium and then I have to subtract some variance risk premium from what I'm hedging. But then I think that it gets more interesting when you talk about the compounding effects. You and I went a little bit back and forth on a text rabbit hole. But maybe you can tee it up even better than I explained it in terms of what the core question was.
Well, maybe not better, but I'll say it more simply because maybe I wasn't paying close enough attention. And as per usual, I was listening at 2x speed, and I think I was getting my last hit of Chick-fil-A. So I might not have been paying close attention because I was getting that sweet fried chicken. By the way, always go double fillet on the patty. It's the perfect fillet to bread ratio. But And shout out to Dean Kernut Alpha Exchange, one of our favorite podcasts, and it's great having Roni on, which, as you said, is one of
Can I just say, sorry, one thing I want to add. Alpha Exchange is the podcast that Flirting with Models would be if I grew up. If I didn't stay Peter Pan and I actually took my job seriously as a podcast host, that's what it would be. But instead, I just do increasingly psychedelic podcast covers, and surprised guests even come on anymore.